In this video, we are going to determine the transformation with the given equation, given functions. So at the top, I wrote a side note, a reference to quickly go back on when determining reflection. So if you have a negative outside a function, such as outside the parentheses, outside the absolute value line, outside the square root, then it will reflect over x-axis. If you have a negative on the x and it's inside the absolute value lines, inside the parentheses, inside the square root, then it will reflect over y-axis. So let's take a look at the first example here. Now here we have negative x to the third power plus 1. So when it comes to x squared and x to the third power, there's one thing you always have to watch out for. Now if there's a negative in front of the x, what I usually do is I write parenthesis on the x, saying that the negative is outside the parenthesis. So it's not within the function, it's not on x. So again, when it's x squared and x to the third power, you can put parentheses unless there was parentheses in the beginning. Now before, we didn't have parentheses. So that means that if there's a negative, then you are allowed to put parentheses on the x only. In doing so, it will help you determine if it's going to reflect over the x-axis or the y-axis. So let's take a look. Negative outside a function, outside the parentheses. So it's similar to this. So it's going to reflect over x-axis. Now there's one more. It's a plus 1 after the function, after the x. So plus 1, that means that it's going to move up 1. So 1 up. So that's all for this function. Now we're going to go over here. We have a negative on the x and it's inside the square root. So it's similar to this. So if it's inside parentheses, inside the absolute value lines, inside the square root, then it's going to reflect over y-axis. So I'm going to write reflect over y-axis. And then we have one more. So it's just like the first one. You have a minus 2 after the x. So it's not inside the square root. So this right here, minus 2 is outside the square root and it's after. That means it's going to either move up or down. Since it's minus 2, it's going to move down 2 units. So 2 down. So here's the transformation for the second example. For example 3, we have g of x equals negative the absolute value of x minus 1. Now, you notice in the previous video where I keep saying of. So, for example, square root or square of. So here, when I'm saying the absolute value of x minus 1 is because there's a variable x and a number within. So just keep in mind why I'm saying that. Now let's take a look for the transformation. We see that there's a negative outside the absolute value line, so it's going to fall underneath this part right here, so reflect over x-axis. So our first one is reflect over x-axis. And then we have one more. We have a minus 1. And it's inside the absolute value line. So that means it's within the function. So when there's a number within the function, it's either going to move left or right. Since this is minus 1, it's going to move 1 unit to the right. So 1 right. Alright, those are the two transformations for the third example. So let's take a look at the fourth example. We have negative x squared plus 3. So just like the first example, we have an x squared and there's negative in front. So you are allowed to put parentheses on the x only. This will help to see that the negative is outside the parentheses, so it's outside the function. So, not to confuse with this, so this is why we put parentheses. We can see that the negative is outside the parentheses, so outside the function. So this one is going to reflect over the x-axis. So that's our first transformation. Reflect over x-axis. Now we have a plus 3. That's outside the parentheses, meaning after the function. So since you have a plus 3 after the x squared, that means that it's going to either move up or down. Since it's plus 3, this one is going to go up 3 units. So 3 up. So here's the two transformations for this function. So in summary, when you see a negative outside the absolute value lines, outside the parentheses, outside the square root, that means that it's going to reflect over the x-axis. Now when you see a negative on the x, just like in the second example, where the negative is on the x and inside the absolute value lines, inside the parentheses, and inside the square root, again, it has to be on the x. It will reflect over the y-axis. Now, even though it was supposed to be over reflection, keep in mind that this is going to be other transformation, such as 1 to the right, 3 up. So keep in mind how these numbers plays a part in these transformation.